I'm Sharon Graham and I'm the Executive Officer. I'm going to be spending a shorter time this morning going through some of the automation pieces that Unite's been doing over the last 7 months. I just want to say right at the beginning of this that obviously there are going to be opportunities in automation. It is estimated domestically that there'll be around 170,000 jobs that will come into the economy. We need to know where they are, we need to organise them, and evidently we need to be part of seizing those opportunities. But the first part of Unite's work in terms of automation has been very much around the threats, so that we are prepared for them, that our stewards know where they are, that we know the lead-in times, that you can access all of that information. So this shortened version is very much around looking at the threats for Unite, but also looking at the threats for society. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of points over the next sort of 15 minutes. You have on your tables or on chairs the automation presentation, and inside it will come up behind me, but you might want to make some notes on it for when I come around the sectors. Inside it, you have the presentation, which I'll go through, but you also have the draft new technology agreement. Now, I won't go through this now, but maybe when we are in the sector conferences where you break up, it might be good to have a conversation just about what's in that agreement and how we are trying to pace set those agreements in our 28,000 recognised areas. I'd just like you, first of all, just to go on to page 1 of the presentation, and what you should see there, and coming up behind me, is really the 20 Unite sectors. And as I said earlier on, we have for 7 months really been slicing and dicing all of the areas in Unite and ranking the Unite sectors in terms of risk, looking at tasks, because it won't always be jobs that go, it will just sometimes be tasks that go, but also looking at jobs in certain areas as well. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I just want to say a couple of things at the beginning around automation. Obviously, it's nothing new. I mean, we saw from the film earlier on, I mean, this is the so-called fourth industrial revolution. But one thing that the economists are all agreed on, whether it's the German economists in Britain or in the US, is that there will be job losses at a scale that didn't happen in the previous 3 times that automation really hit. The figures are between 35% and 42%. They believe those will be the number of jobs that will go in the economy. But even if they're half right, even if it's less than that, we as the biggest union in Britain and Ireland need to be prepared. And crucially, as Len said earlier on, we need to be pace setting in that regard. The other thing to say, and it was touched on briefly in the questions, is that there are some people who are talking about particular silver bullets to automation, that if we only had something called the universal basic income or a minimum incomes guarantee, then actually everything would be okay. Unite thinks that's very dangerous. First and foremost, we should be fighting for work to be a central pillar of society. So first of all, we want jobs, we want to fight for jobs. But secondly, are we saying that we accept universal basic income as a replacement for work? I mean, are we saying as a society that we accept that? Who's going to tell us what the rate is that we get? In a capitalist system, we don't always come off very well when they decide what the rate is that people get. So there's a whole range of things around universal basic income, which again, we'll talk about more when we meet, that we want to be able to be prepared for. And it may be part of a solution, but we don't think it can be seen as the answer. If you look at the arrow there on page 1, you can see the different sectors. And again, there's a bigger document that goes through why is sectors in high-risk areas or low-risk areas. And broadly speaking, as you come through that arrow, those 11 sectors in the top there are seen to be the sectors at the highest risk. When we look at the ranking, when we look at the technology, when we look at what the economists are saying. Now, things can move in and out, so obviously, sectors can move around, but broadly speaking, there are 650,000 Unite members just in those top 11 sectors that you can see there. And at the rate that the economists are talking about, on average, 230,000 of those jobs would go. That doesn't even touch the sides when you think there's only 170,000 jobs coming into the economy at the moment. That's what people believe the figure will be. As you come down the bottom part of the arrow there, you see the sectors at lower risk. And just to give a couple of examples here that I think are important, you see the service industries listed there. And it's not because areas within the service industry, cleaning, for example, couldn't be automised. It's at the moment the cleaner is less expensive than the robot. So as we move terms and conditions of employment, as we move wages up, then of course sectors begin to move into high risk areas. The interesting sector there that you can see in the lower risk area, community use and not-for-profit, at the moment, jobs that require empathy, that require an assessment of an individual in front of you, that require you to understand the situation, haven't been able to be taken over by robots because they don't have emotional intelligence. So those types of sectors are actually seen as being protected and probably will be some of the growing sectors as we go through. If I can ask you to move on to page 2 of the document and just briefly here, the 230,000 members that I spoke of, so the top 11 sectors have 650,000 Unite members, roughly around 230,000, 35% are predicted to go. And if you then look at our regions, this is where that would fall. And again, in the bigger document, in the bigger discussion, you will see this in far more detail. What we want to have by March 2018, and there's a big discussion with the union that we're having at the moment, is 2 separate pieces of information. One will be your sector, a bespoke document on your sector, the types of automation that's coming in Industry 4.0, the lead-in times, etc. But we also want you to have that for your region so that we can understand what is going to happen to Unite in a particular region. So there will be 2 separate documents ready for the March executive that we will be putting forward. If I can now ask you to look on page 3 of the presentation, and again, what's on page 3 here is really quite a big discussion in the full document. But what I've tried to put here on page 3 is to really give some sense of what are the new technologies that's driving the change. As we said, it's nothing new, but why is Industry 4.0 so different? And it's really the escalation of the change. It's going hugely fast. You can see there in the examples on advances in machines learning, the 4th bullet point. Sensory artificial intelligence, you know, quite an interesting area, but on that area, in 6 years, if the employers wished to do it and there was no pushback, all of the stuff around phone banking, all of that type of work could be wiped out in 6 years. So it's the technological changes and the advancements and how fast they're moving that is really causing Industry 4.0 to be quite different from what things have had before. The Internet of Things, you can see that there on the 2nd bullet point. Most of our 20 sectors will be affected by this. This is the ability for devices to connect to each other, logistics talking to workplaces, talking to parts of workplaces, where actually you might have 20,000 workers working across a number of sites now, and you would only need a handful of workers once the Internet of Things and robotics comes into those particular workplaces. Just the final thing on page 3 that I wanted to say was about the internet. And I you know, sometimes when you put the internet in, it can get a tad confused with other things that are going on with the internet. We are well used to seeing things like online banking, online booking of hotels, etc. One of the things that the internet has moved the furthest, which isn't actually automation, but I think it's worth talking about, is the gig economy. And the gig economy, which is rampant casualisation, is being moved hugely quickly because of the internet, the speed of the internet and the platforms, and that is only going to get bigger as the years progress. If I can now ask you to go on to page 4 of the presentation, I just want to make one point on page 4 around the trade union response. And people spoke about, you know, domestic unions coming together, and, you know, Len quite rightly said we will need to pace set because that will be what happens. But actually this is a global issue, and things like transnational combines with multinational employers, should we be creating those? And I'll talk about that in a second. But really across the world, there hasn't really been a good enough response to this. There's piecemeal responses in different places and different unions trying to fight back in different areas. But you'll see there on page 4, the only other real area there's been a lot of detail on Industry 4.0 is IG Metall in Germany. And they've done a lot of work on this, but they have a very different take on it because they believe they will build the robots. Therefore, they see this as something hugely positive. But this is at the heart of what we're saying as Unite in terms of our political demands. Where is our platforms to build the robots? Where's our technology to build the robots? Where is our apprenticeships to build the robots? And obviously, that's important that we've got the industrial and the political driving at the same time. You'll see there on page 5, just moving you into page 5 now, in the bigger document and the wider discussions we're having in workplaces with stewards, we're having at the sector committees, that we're having at the risks and the regional committees, we've broken the response down into 3 main areas. One is the short-term industrial, the long-term industrial, and obviously the political. And in the short-term industrial response, you'll see that there are a number of things, this isn't the whole list here, that we want to try and bring things together. So we want to try and gather together information to have a risk register. If you work in food and cyber-physical systems come in, what does that mean for jobs and how long does it take for it to come in? So that you're aware of what the new forms of technology are across your sector and how you can find more information about that. You can also see bargaining for security there. Obviously, agreements. We need to have good new technology agreements. There's a draft in your packs. But the bullet point after that, I think, is the most important one for everything we do, that we must develop strike-ready workplaces. We have 28,000 agreements, 36,000 workplaces are covered. Are they ready should we need to do something? That's your decision. But are they actually in a place? Have we got the organisation? Have we got what we need to drive that forward? You'll see alternative strategies there. So leverage, obviously, is something we have in our armoury. We want to be able to develop that and to move that in a way that if an employer said, well, it's lights out in terms of this plant or this operation in 6 weeks' time, then we would have to push back against that. And how would we do that if strike action wasn't something that we was able to work there? The final thing on page 5 is the fighting fund. Unite has a £35 million strike fund, and obviously we want to be able to make sure that we have a fund that if you need to download for experts, if you need to get information, if we need to do things as far as automation is concerned, that we are ready and we're not caught needing in that particular situation. Moving now on to page 6, you can see really the front of the agreement there. I just want to say one thing on page 6, which is around the payback. The new technology agreement that you've got before you talks about the usual things that I'm sure you all know, but then talks about things around a shorter working week, around retirement policies. Are these things now that we can begin to develop and pace set in our agreements? And obviously that will be linked to our strength and obviously linked to how we do this in a coordinated way. Moving now on to page 7, you can see here we're looking more at the long-term industrial response. And there's quite an interesting piece, I think, that can play into this. Unite's not the only biggest union in Britain and Ireland, but of the 9 critical infrastructure areas of the British and Irish economy that the government have put and said these are the most important areas of the economy: health, transport, food, finance, etc. Unite lead in 7 of those areas. And so therefore, what we're talking about in the document as a conversation is, could we in Unite cause a crisis if we needed to? We are in some of the most powerful areas of the economy. What does that mean? And is it something we should prepare for? You can see there at the bottom of page 7, I talk about pace setters, which is this point that we raised earlier, which are the areas that we are going to drive the agreements in first. Moving now to page 8 of the document, you'll see there the part of the bigger document that I think is the most important part of our conversation around automation, which is, what does a 21st century industrial manifesto look like? If we were asked that, if we wanted to say that, what would we be saying that we as a union were demanding politically? And you can see there on page 8, we talk about legislation, and I think that line's really important, that retains work as a central pillar to society, so that the legislation we're calling for does that, but also, could we get a bigger piece of the pie? Could we get a better share of the profits that are being made there. And you can see that we talk around shorter working weeks, retirement policies obviously, but also research and development. Where is that? And how can we as the union force some of those things through? Finally, on page 9, we talk about what the next steps are. And as Len alluded to in his speech, we are having a very detailed conversation with our stewards. We're going around the country. I've been in a number of areas already, in a number of workplaces already. And after those initial meetings have happened, each of those groups are coming back together to look at those 4 bullet points there that you see on page 9. What's already happened, and did we get enough from it? You know, so can we learn from what's happened in the past? What's happening now that is good, because there are some good agreements out there, there's some good stuff happening out there. How can we learn from that? But critically, what do our stewards and reps consider to be the things that we should be demanding short-term and long-term industrially, but also what we should be demanding politically? And as I say, we want to draw all of this together before the March Executive, so we've got 2 very clear documents from the conversations that we've had with our stewards. So, Tony, I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you later.